Welcome to the very first event of the brand new Office of Public Policy Events. Tonight's event, The Constitution on Campus, a conversation on free speech and affirmative action. I'm Richmond Nguyen, Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at UNF, and I'm glad you are here. I bring regrets on behalf of President Limayam, who had planned to be here tonight, and he is just returning from unexpected international travel. So as you might imagine, he is recuperating and cannot make it this evening, but he desperately wanted to be here. In introducing today's program's panelists, I want to start with a brief overview of tonight's program, and this overview was actually provided by our panelists. September 17th through the 23rd is Constitution Week. It provides opportunities to examine how the Constitution informs some of the most controversial issues in American politics today, particularly issues that affect life on college campuses. In Florida and elsewhere, a great deal of attention in policy has focused on what can be said and or taught in the classroom and around campus. At the national level, a recent Supreme Court ruling has greatly restricted the ability of admissions offices to consider race as a factor in their decisions. Tonight, several UNF professors specializing in law and politics will offer information, discussion, and friendly debate on these topics. There will be opportunities for you to pose questions at the end of the conversation. Our panelists are all esteemed faculty members in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration in the College of Arts and Sciences. To my far right, we welcome Associate Instructor and Director of Pre-Law and Faculty Fellow for Intellectual Diversity and Academic Freedom, Adrienne Lerner. We also welcome Assistant Professors of American Politics and Political Behavior, Dr. James Fahey, Dr. Sean Frieder, and Dr. Seth Warner. And now, I will turn the program over to Dr. Frieder.
Well, first of all, just wanted to say thanks for being here and welcome. Post-pandemic, it is difficult to attract an audience to a thing that is not happening in class hours, so it's late at night and you're on campus, so thank you for that alone. I want to just say briefly before we launch into this that this is a great opportunity, these debate series that we're having, to give folks a chance to see what a reasonable debate can look like. You know, when we talk about politics, often the place where we do that is on social media. We have the presidential primary debates and general debates, and the tone of all those things has been pretty nasty for a while now. And so we think that this is an opportunity, in addition to providing some good information to y'all about relevant topics, to also just see what a reasonable debate can look like. So we are four people on stage. We all know each other. We all chose these topics, not just because they're relevant, not just because they're timely. They are. There have been recent court rulings on them. There's been recent legislation in the state involving this stuff, but also because these are issues where we think reasonable people can disagree with each other. So you're going to see us disagree, but it's not going to be this heated debate where it's clearly two oppositional viewpoints. They're going to have two viewpoints, but you're going to see some overlap. You're going to see this not necessarily connect to the left and the right spectrum is the way that we're kind of used to having these debates. And so the format of this, just really quickly, we're going to have two different topics, as was said before. We're going to kind of change our roles over time between moderating and being presenters on those opposite sides. So for this first topic here, I'm going to be the moderator for it. And Professors Fahey and Professor Warner have agreed to present opposing sides on the topic of to what extent should speech on campus be unfettered versus regulated. But before we have each of these presentations for each of these rounds, we're going to have Professor Lerner, who is our legal expert here, provide us with some legal background as to what it is exactly we're talking about. So take it away.
All right, well, if I'm starting with Dr. Frieder's assertion about there being unfettered free speech on campus. Come on, Dr. Frieder. There is an unfettered free speech on campus, but public campuses are a laboratory for free expression and for the First Amendment. There's actually a high bar that the state has that prevents them from discriminating against forms of speech based on content or viewpoint that has to meet strict scrutiny. They have to prove a compelling state interest, and they're limited in other ways as well. There's a lesser but still quite high bar if we have a content and neutral restriction on speech, but we're restricting for time, place, or manner. We also can't have overbroad and vague restrictions that don't give folks notice or are difficult to interpret or enforce or might catch up protected speech in their web. And there are other, fetters on that too. So there are definitely ways in which we can talk about and regulate speech. Obviously, speech that we can engage on in, say, the green is different from what you can do in a classroom or your dorms or where you are governed right by the student code of conduct. But we also do have, as I've said, a laboratory for the First Amendment. And anyone who has been on our campus knows that it is used for free expression activity, right? So if you take a public space like the green, that is governed by the Florida Campus Free Expression Act. It's a public forum for 1A protected speech and expressive conduct. We're not allowed to designate free speech zones on this campus, right? So we can't say if you want to engage in a protest or you want to have any kind of speech on campus, then we're going to put you all the way at the amphitheater where no one can hear your message or where you're more restricted. We can't regulate other things, signs that you carry, right, based on the content of those. And these kind of restrictions don't reach into the classroom, but there have been, right, new and recent rules, especially here in Florida, legal moves to actually debate or to talk about or to restrict what is covered in the classroom. So these are rules like the Stop Woke Act, SB 266, and others. And some of these have had potential chilling effects on how students and professors discuss things, or if not the content themselves, then how they are presented and how people perceive that presentation. Discourse is part and parcel of the university. And discourse is sometimes uncomfortable, but it is inherent to our educational mission as a university. And this is expressed in two kind of collateral, outside the First Amendment, but collateral rights of academic freedom of faculty as disciplinary experts to teach the things that are necessary in their field, but also your right as students to learn, right? And these two things go hand in hand. Most free speech debates about speech on campus aren't strictly about law, right? So some of the things that we're going to discuss here today maybe go beyond our particular legal landscape as we have it now. These are about policy and social values as well. And some of the arguments today actually question current court interpretations or standards of the First Amendment. And they question whether they achieve a desirable result between individual free expression rights and maybe social good, right? These are difficult things to balance. And sometimes we're talking about the interests or rights of two individual opposed speakers, right? Fundamental questions that we'll deal with are how much freedom of speech do state professors have in the classroom? What happens when either regulation or speech potentially interrupts the educational mission of the university, be it from direct censorship or just from threatening a student's sense of well-being or belonging, or chilling effects where people don't know what speech is prohibited or not. And then what is hurt in terms of speech, and what are the moral and legal options for addressing that hurt while preserving individual liberty.
All right, thank you very much. So we're going to now move to the debate portion of this stage and presenting the relatively less restrictions on free speech side. We have Professor Warner, and presenting the relatively more restrictions on free speech side, we have Professor Fahey. So we're going to start over here. Professor Warner, take it away.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I think to start, I want to echo what Professor Lerner was saying, is that this is a matter of degree, right? There are always restrictions on free speech. Some of those are from the government. So for instance, you can't intimidate somebody, right? Intimidation is not protected speech, and that has been used to, have laws against cross-burning, for instance, in the past. You can't incite lawlessness by shouting fire in a crowded theater. You can't harass somebody, and harass here under the legal definition, which is narrower than what we might think of as being harassing, but to chase somebody around, right? And to chase somebody around and to cause them emotional distress with no real reason. Those are limits that the government sets. Other limits are inherent in private or semi-public venues like the classroom. Each of us as professors has some sort of policy on classroom conduct, and our commitment to free speech regardless, we would never ever let one student target another group, another student say something disparaging about a social group, cause frequent disturbances in class, all these things. So there's always some limit on free speech. The question then is not so much, are we going to have an entirely open door, or going to have an entirely closed door, heavens no, but rather exactly how open or closed it's going to be. I'm going to be taking the point of view that it should be relatively more open, and I'm going to couch that in recent debates that we've had here in Florida. I specifically want to highlight two pieces of legislation. The first was the Florida Campus Free Expression Act, which was passed about 5 years ago. And that keeps universities from restricting protest rights to certain parts of campus. It also imposes higher fines on people who are trying to shout down invited speakers. And then another one, and this is a little bit different, would be the Stop Woke Act, which listed 7 ideas that professors around race and meritocracy that professors can't endorse in the classroom. And that's been struck down by the court since. I don't necessarily expect Dr. Fahey to defend that, but we're arguing here the principle of non-expert legislators controlling or basically saying what types of messages can and can't be shared in class. So kind of focusing my argument on those two things, I think something interesting that Professor Lerner mentioned is that ideology on free speech doesn't always align with partisan debates. So I'm taking the more free speech side here, right, which means I'm supportive of the Florida Campus Free Expression Act, and I'm in opposition to the Stop Woke Act. Now, both of those pieces of legislation were passed by conservative legislators in Tallahassee, right? So I'm not Republican, I'm not Democrat, I'm just more free speech as opposed to less. With that all said, right, why do I say that it should be more open? I think my central argument is that when administrators cancel speakers because it's controversial, or when legislators say that I can't say certain things in the classroom, these are all efforts by authorities to limit the range of ideas that you can be exposed to for your own good. And I'm making the case that it's a cornerstone of a liberal society that government doesn't get to decide what you get to be exposed to for your own good. Certainly, it oversteps our authority as educators to say that certain people shouldn't be allowed to speak on campus. I think it absolutely goes beyond, and the courts agree, politicians, the government's role in being able to say what things should be allowed to be said or not in classes. My second argument is this, right? Now, kind of anticipating why we might want to have a slightly more closed regime is that, some ugly stuff really does get said, right? Protesters will come to campuses and they could be, white supremacists. They could be religious fundamentalists. And I'm with everybody. It's hard to see really what value that type of speech adds. But my secondary claim here is that claims that speech are harmful are generally overstated. In my experience, folks tend to have more grit than maybe they've been ascribed. Especially over the last 10 to 20 years, where we've been living in a polarized era where, we're constantly afraid of the bogeyman coming from the other side. Whereas, in fact, most people are, kind-spirited, or if not entirely kind, they don't harbor, deep and powerful intolerance that would threaten anybody else. In my experience teaching, I always say when we're discussing controversial things, or I'm sharing images or videos that might have something disturbing, I always say everybody's threshold is different. I'm not going to force a student, to sit in class, if they're becoming overwhelmed by kind of what we're discussing or what they're seeing. And I've had hundreds of students, and I say that every time because I believe it, right? Everybody's different, and it's not my place to judge what feelings people have. But nobody's ever really taken me up on that offer, right? And that leads me to believe, just out of anecdotal experience, that folks are pretty tough. Right? That there's in the discourse, there's been an emphasis on protecting people from harm, and I don't think certainly speech can be upsetting, speech can be disgusting even, but I think that there is more benefit to having the door open if hateful things are said, finding some way of counter-organizing against that. Where I went to as an undergraduate, the Westboro Baptist Church came and they protested on campus. And they said absolutely disgusting things about our LGBT students. And we had 100 times more people counter-organizing against that, and it became a unifying event for the campus. So I know that can't happen every last time somebody shows up on campus to say something disturbing. But I think it's ultimately to the public benefit that we don't play with that slippery slope of making things more closed, and that we keep it relatively more open.
All right, thanks, Professor Fahey, for that. And now presenting the relatively more restrictions on campus free speech, Professor Fahey.
All right, so thank you. Okay, so one way that you can sort of see that speech is powerful is that Dr. Warner got to go first, and he got to claim that I'm the anti-free speech person.
No, you
He's
love
the pro
speech.
free speech person.
You love speech.
Which shows like how framing in speech is important. Because I could equally say that I'm going to articulate the pro-civil rights and Dr. Warner the anti-civil rights perspective. But I of course don't mean that. So much of my argument is going to be built around essentially two recognitions that might be somewhat uncomfortable. The first is that we routinely restrict free speech in ways that we probably don't even think about, but are mostly okay with. And the second is that in our protection of free speech, we routinely ask precisely those people who are subject to the most structural harm in American politics to keep taking that brunt so that other more privileged groups can exercise their rights that they're already sort of empowered to enact. So one example of this that might not be that shows you that the sort of line is not that precise is something like harassment, right? We talked about harassment. That's defined as unwelcome conduct based on an individual's identity, usually systematic, and that leads to a hostile environment, right? The most common form of harassment is through speech acts, right? Through unwanted advances or a variety of things. So all employers kind of accept any public funding kind of already restrict free speech in some important ways. And we could stand to reason whether or not, say, continually allowing certain groups to come to campus and harass other students on the basis of their identity, whether that constituted harassment and whether trespassing them from campus is a restriction of free speech. So taking the two laws at hand here, the Florida Campus Free Expression Act and the Stop Woke Act, I'm going to try and propose arguments a little bit harder in the Stop Woke Act and why it's acceptable for the door to sometimes be more closed. I'll even accept Dr. Warner's framing here. So first, when it comes to the Florida Campus Free Expression Act, the Florida Campus Free Expression Act does a lot of different things. And one of the things it does is it makes it illegal to designate some areas of campus for protest while keeping others off limits. And Dr. Lerner kind of pointed this out, that one way that you could use this to chill free speech would be to put that free speech zone way off, on the side of campus. But I could tell you a different story about where free speech zones might have some real social good. So I went to UF for my PhD, and during that time, we had a free speech zone, at least for part of it, prior to this act on campus. And this was almost solely for practical reasons. And it was basically that female students were being harassed and subject to graphic images of fake abortions as they were walking through campus. And so they created a free speech zone, and that free speech zone was right in the middle of campus, but it did allow students to walk around without being subject to this harm. They could choose not to engage in this speech. I argue that like the university is sort of making a reasonable decision here to privilege the right of their students to attain high quality education without verbal harassment, be it legally harassment or not, over the rights of some people to like present graphic imagery. The other thing that the Florida Campus Free Expression Act does is it stops people from heckling controversial speakers to the point that they cannot speak, which is anti-heckler's veto provisions, basically. That if we were having this speech right now and someone came in and just started screaming at me constantly, like that would be annoying, though we would all go home earlier, so some people might be pro that. But that would essentially restrict my speech in some way, is the kind of argument there. The alternate argument would be that protest is also counter speech, right? And so restricting people's ability to protest might itself be a free speech restriction. All right, then I'll move on to the Stop Woke Act, and I'll finish this up quickly because I think I'd rather hear more other people than continue to dominate the Speech Act. So I'm going to leave open the question of whether or not I agree with the assessment of some in Tallahassee that certain groups are targeted on campus, and whether I agree with the groups that they've identified. But I do think that there are cases when professors might allow students to disparage other groups, or when professors themselves disparage other groups. And I might disagree about which groups need protection, but the university already does restrict free speech that violates the code of conduct. And so if I wanted to teach a course where I made the claim that races biologically exist and some races are superior to others, and that's my opinion, well, of course I'd be prevented from teaching that class. And so I think that's a good thing. This is different because it kind of touches on employment laws, but just to say that basically there are places where your speech is restricted, universities are places of higher education and learning, and your degree is a stamp from that institution that says that this person was trained in this way and we vouch for them. You're going to leave here with a degree from UNF. It means something, it's valuable, and one of our promises is that during it, you actually got an education. And there are some ways in which this type of speech might restrict your ability to get that education. So in that, and I'm going to end with that, and I hope you all enjoyed my Orwellian attack on free speech rights, and I will await some more questioning.
Thank you for that. We're at the point in the round now where I'm going to ask a couple tricky questions to each of our presenters and try and pry a little bit more at this. So we'll start over here again with Professor Warner. So on the topic of invited speakers to campus, my alma mater, I got my PhD at Berkeley, and some of you may remember Berkeley being on the news several years ago with a lot of gnashing of teeth and fighting between folks. My favorite video you can find online is the fireball that someone threw from the building that I taught onto the sidewalk. So things can get nasty. The question I'm building towards is there's a few different things that happened. Clubs were inviting speakers that they were pretty openly acknowledging that their goal was not to like learn more from the great minds of America. It was to kind of troll the campus and cause the gnashing of teeth. They were invited for that purpose. As a result, university had to absorb actually a large security cost, which, that's a cost to both students and faculty alike. If we're going to spend money on security, might not spend it in other places. And it got to the point where, because of these events, people that weren't even students, people coming from off campus began to see us as like a place on which they could wage war against each other, not students, just outsiders. So considering all the stuff that I've seen happen, should there be any kinds of considerations we should make for restrictions of speakers on campus if there's potential for danger, if it costs money to the campus, anything like that?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two separate questions that I see. The first is, should universities allow speech? And the second is, should universities fund speech? And my answers are yes and sometimes. And the fund speech is a big one, right? Because the one important thing is that if we're going to set conditions on who gets money to put on these events, it needs to be content neutral, right? universities should not be systemically funding left-oriented speakers over right-oriented speakers. But universities, professors, are in a position to judge the substantive contribution of a speaker, right? If somebody doesn't have many qualifications, we know isn't adding much to the debate, so long as it's consistent between left and right, I think it's reasonable for a university to say we're not going to spend tuition money, we're not going to spend taxpayer money to pay their speaker fees. We're not going to spend money on security beyond what we would ordinarily provide for a speaker, and that's a content-neutral judgment based on the quality of those speakers. I know the ones at Berkeley, these were right-wing speakers. I think it would be the same if it was a left-wing speaker or a comedian there that was just there to bash the President Trump or what have you. Now, that was my answer to the second question, are they responsible for funding it? And I say no, not in all cases. Are they responsible for allowing it? My answer there would be yes. If there is, Milo Yiannopoulos, somebody who charges $20,000 as a speaker fee to come and sow discontent and say right-wing things, maybe that doesn't add a whole lot to the discourse. Maybe tuition and taxpayer dollars shouldn't be spent toward that end. But if the group already has the money and wants to pay for it themselves, it absolutely has to be allowed. So that's my position. Yeah.
All right, Professor Fahey. A lot of the talk about the Stop Woke Act is about the fact that professors might engage in self-censorship to potentially avoid coming into contact with that law in a harmful way. Ostensibly, the Stop Woke Act might exist for one reason, to prevent student self-censorship. So what do you think about that? Does it accomplish that goal? Should students be concerned about self-censorship in the classroom?
Yeah, so I guess like Dr. Warner, I'm going to say that those are two questions. So in terms of the question on, the Stop Woke Act, I am going to go ahead and say I'm not a professor who would like the state to be telling me what I can and can't teach in the classroom. And so in that case, right, I think I am concerned about that because it sort of restricts my ability to provide a high quality education to students. And so I sort of oppose that. Now, the question of whether or not it leads to like chilled speech, so basically whether or not, and sort of more broadly, whether students should ever be like fearful of expressing certain points of view in the classroom, my answer is that students should be fearful of expressing certain points of view in the classroom. There are obviously points of view you should not express in my classroom, that certain races are superior to others, that certain genders are superior to others, that, that the New York Yankees are a good baseball team. I don't know, like variety of different things that are bad, right? But there's certain things that are true and certain things that are untrue. And a lot of things that happen when you don't speak, it's because you are concerned that the norms, that people will basically sanction you socially because you have expressed something that goes against the prevailing norms that we all hold, right? And so when you engage in, for instance, like blatantly racist speech and you are chilled for that, that is a way that society is functioning to enact and reinforce norms. And I think that that's actually okay. And I think that what professors have to do is ensure that the norms that are being enforced are basically norms that are more or less universally held by productive members of society and not just their own, prescriptive viewpoints. And that ultimately involves trusting teachers. And I think we should do that. So that's where I stand.
Quick parting question to Professor Lerner. We've had some talk about free speech zones so far in this discussion. What about safe spaces? Maybe a quick, what are those and thoughts on those?
Oh, well, at least you asked it as two questions to me, so I'll entertain that. I'm going to go ahead and while I explain safe spaces in my answers and say no safe spaces, right, in a university. And that's because I probably disagree with what the framework of like safe spaces is how it's presented, right? So you should absolutely have a space for your free association and speech with like-minded people in, say, student clubs and groups and other organizations that you may join that you can host here on campus. And you should get to engage in counter speech, right? The most effective way often, if you don't like a speaker on campus, is to have an alternative event where you can engage or facilitate the speech that you want. So that isn't running away from speech. That isn't a safe space where people are going not to engage, not to discuss things academically, not to exercise their liberties under the First Amendment, but it is simply finding a space for other speech and free association on campus. So no space, but definitely more speech and more association.
All right, so I'm going to awkwardly take off my temporary moderator hat and bestow upon you, Professor Fahey, official moderator duties for this next section.
All right, great. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to, I guess I'll vamp for a moment to get you ready because now Professor Lerner is going to do the same thing that she did prior, which is provide some legal background to our second debate topic, which is going to focus a little bit on affirmative action and admissions. And then we'll start with Dr. Frieder before Dr. Warner will now be in the unenviable position of following. So Professor Lerner, take it away.
I'll try to do this sitting down for those of you who've had me in class. I am tied to this chair so that I do not wander the stage like I do in class. Affirmative action in higher education takes its patterns and principle from the civil rights era, from protections and fostering diversity in employment, and from the mission to desegregate schools. So affirmative action was intended as a remedy to the effects of long-standing discrimination against minority candidates in admissions to higher education, and to address potential barriers to admission that result from inequalities in our K through 12 school system, right? So K through 12 schools are not the same. They have inequitable funding. Some of that is because they are based largely on area property taxes, others because other states have systems in which they kind of allocate funding to schools. And the opportunities and results from our public school system are different when we break those down for, say, geography or race or gender or income of the surrounding neighborhood. And the Supreme Court has actually reinforced these kind of disparate funding schemes, going back to a case from the 70s called San Antonio v. Rodriguez, in which they kind of struck down Texas, redistributing funding among school systems. And so precedent and the legal bounds of affirmative action have been going back and forth in the court, but largely affirmative action precedent was upheld by the Supreme Court in a case called Bollinger in 2003, but the court has also put some boundaries on what that looked like in an admissions framework, right? So in University of California v. Fahey, they said, like, no quotas, right? You can't just say 20% of your class must be of some race or some gender, but you can use things as like a tie break or a plus factor. And that's largely in systems, admission systems that had considered race, gender, or other affirmative action categories, had kind of used this tie break. And we should probably say here that admissions based on a strictly numeric system, your IB scores, your AP scores, your SATs or ACTs, right? And holistic admissions, those essays you had to write, right? Everything that kind of goes into this big pile of things, those clubs that you joined in high school, right? So those holistic things, both of those systems create disparate results, and often those results favor wealthier students, right? So you're going to hear some debate on kind of two ways to consider applicants, but I'm going to put that out there as just kind of an empirical framework. The legal precedent challenges to affirmative action are a really cool kind of legal story in themselves, because they are the result of, like, affirmative action itself was upheld by impact litigation, but the kind of crusade against it in the courts is a great story of impact litigation in terms of persistence. So lawyer Edward Blum took 2 cases against the University of Texas with a plaintiff, Abigail Fisher. These are Fisher 1 and Fisher 2, that these cases where the court actually didn't side with Fisher and upheld some parts of using affirmative action in both higher ed and law school admissions with some restrictions. But then the lawyer decided, okay, I can build a better test. So started Students for Fair Admission, put out a website and asked for students, particularly Asian American students who had high metrics but had not gotten into target schools, right, to put together a case to challenge affirmative action and then brought action against the University of North Carolina and Harvard Law. And those cases went all the way to the Supreme Court with a decision this last June in those cases where we ended race-based affirmative action in college admissions. So again, that's just legal bounds. These debates wrap law and policy together and go beyond just mere legal considerations. This is a policy debate about the merits of diversity as an educational and social goal, as well as affirmative action or other programs. Are they an appropriate remedy to inequalities in our public education system before the college level? And significantly a question about the promise of Brown v. Board, right? The separate the no separate schooling case that started desegregation and the scope of the 14th Amendment equal protection.
Okay, wonderful. I learned something. I hope you all did as well. I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Frieder, who's going to begin broadly with the sort of defensive affirmative action case, followed by Dr. Warner, who is going to call into question some of its goals and aims. But I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks. So I'll start with just reinforcing the technical point that Professor Lerner made there. She's explaining how affirmative action programs actually work in practice. I just want to start by making sure that the image that people have in their head of the average one of these programs is a correct image. And she mentioned the tiebreaker system. That's what we're really talking about here. When this is functioning, at least as I would conceive of it correctly, is this is a small boost between two otherwise very, very similar seeming candidates, that maybe there would be a consideration in that sense based on race. So if we're talking about that, race as a potential tiebreaker, as a small boost, that seems reasonable to me. If we're talking about an affirmative action system that goes far beyond that, that's putting unqualified people into the college system, that's something that I would be opposed to. And I think that largely the affirmative action system is much closer to that conception of tiebreakers, but we have seen certainly some egregious cases. I also want to just briefly open with the argument that is by far the most common argument made for the affirmative action system, and not spend too much time on it, because I want to get to some other arguments that you may have heard less. But the general argument for affirmative action is a moral argument that this is one means by which we might reduce racial inequality in education, maybe specifically, and maybe in wealth and income generally. I think that there's ample evidence that such a thing needs to happen. We have hundreds of years of explicitly non-race neutral policy that's led us to a position where we have the issues that we're dealing with today. And I think it's a little bit of a mental fantasy to think that we can work our way out of those positions without at least considering some aspects of policy that might be non-race neutral in a way that undoes some of that stuff. But I mean, if we're just looking at the basic statistics, I mean, you can see wealth disparities are massive. And they're massive generally right now, but they're particularly massive when you bring race into it. Just an example of this, again, we're talking not income. Income's closer, but wealth, built up wealth over time, which comes from hundreds of years, generational wealth, etc. We're talking, if you look at the average white American, for instance, 180,000 in wealth is, I think, the number. If you look at Black and Latino families on average combined together, it's about 30,000. So there's a five-fold disparity. That's gigantic. Now you might say, but we did solve a bunch of problems back during the civil rights era, so that stuff must be going away. If you look at the rate of change, it's not only not going away, that racial gap has slightly increased over the past 40 years. So this is an ongoing issue. I could say a lot more about this, but I do want to leave some time to just move on to arguments you may not have heard otherwise. When it comes to affirmative action specifically on college campuses, As much as it would massage my ego to be able to think that the main thing that you're getting out of being here on college campus is all the great stuff we up here are teaching you in our classes, realistically, I read the research on education. It ain't. You're getting skills, you're getting knowledge for sure. It's great that you're in all of our classes, but at the same time, the research is very clear that the college experience is transformative because of the people that you meet when you come to campus. And I'm sure many of you right now can think of examples of exactly how that's changed your lives. It's an opportunity to get out of whatever bubble, either an urban bubble or a rural bubble or a suburban bubble that we lived in, and meet people that don't come from the same background as us. And I think diversity in that sense across a bunch of different criteria is a really great thing, but where that is sorely lacking historically has been when it comes to race. So I think that there's a case that one of the outcomes that the university wants to foster is explicitly to have a diverse community, because you're learning from each other. You're learning from us somewhat, but it's really this one time in your life that you get to learn from a very diverse group. I'll just close by saying that I think there is quite a need there to at least consider race somewhat, again, as a tiebreaker kind of thing in admissions, because the metrics that we're using, I don't necessarily know how much faith we can really have in those as objective metrics. There's a reason why a lot of universities are moving away from the ACT and the SAT right now. They have not shown to predict the things like college success that we would expect them to predict. So we're moving away from some of those objective measures because we're discovering that they're not that objective. And in my background, one of the things I did to get myself through grad school, as we often do, is pick up a side job, and my side job was doing ACT, SAT tutoring. Who were my clients? Who could afford my offering of tutoring? I was working mostly for very wealthy families. So you're getting this automatic advantage through the system just because you have access to resources that other people don't have. So, if we're looking at two people that have very equal scores, one person comes from a very privileged background that they were given any resources that they might want to have. The other person comes from a background where they still got that score despite all the obstacles put up in front of them. If what I'm really trying to discover is their latent ability to be successful in college, even if there's a pretty wide difference in those objective numbers, I'm not necessarily sure that the person that has much better numbers is necessarily the most college prepared. They very well may be, but it's not as clear as we'd like it to be. And that makes us uncomfortable. I think we should be a little bit uncomfortable.
All right, Dr. Warner, you're up.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess I'll start by saying, so just like Dr. Frieder's side gig during graduate school, I worked for a few years before I entered academia, and I worked in college admissions. I was an admissions officer. And at the institution I worked at, we were not, so elite that we're, looking for reasons to say no to everybody left and right. But it was a good school. It was also a small school. The classes were rigorous, reading and writing intensive. And so, as part of the application review, we'd look primarily to see that they'd be capable of doing the work if admitted and if they decided to come. But then secondarily, because again, this was a small campus of about 1,000 students, we were curious kind of what they would contribute, right? How they would fit in and, what the benefit to us of them being around was. Ultimately, everybody brings their own value, right? Again, we weren't looking for any reasons to say no. But it's true, right? When a student came from a background that was not suburban middle class, that was attractive to us because it brought something new into our environment and it gave students more opportunity to consider new perspectives. So nothing I say should be construed as an argument against diversity, and I feel very firmly in the value of diversity. What I will be speaking more against is not so much the tiebreaker or the bonus point or just the general awareness of diversity, so much as what I'll argue against with some gusto, in fact, are the egregious cases that we see out of elite institutions that the Supreme Court struck down. So in my last remarks, I said that free expression is a cornerstone of a liberal society, and it's one cornerstone, and I think that another cornerstone is that no person should be discriminated against for traits that are out of their control and that don't have any effect on their ability to do the job. There is such thing as discrimination that happens, legally, right? There are three separate levels that the courts and constitutional law have set. There's the rational basis, there's intermediate scrutiny, and there's strict scrutiny. Rational basis is when, okay, yeah, there is a thing that you can't control, but it's not one of the heavy hitters, historically speaking. It's not something that we need to protect civil rights on this necessarily. It's something that there's a reasonable basis. So the archetypal examples are if you have a vision impairment, you might not be allowed to drive, right? We have an interest in safe roads, and so people who can't see won't be able to get their driver's licenses. Or children, they haven't fully developed in terms of their intellect. They're not allowed to vote, right? There's nothing they can do about being children at the moment, but they're not allowed to vote. But all these heavy hitters, the big social characteristics like gender, race, religion, in many cases disability as well, fall under either the intermediate or the strict scrutiny standards. And what that is to say is that it needs to be an overwhelming interest before some discrimination happens on these bases, for some discrimination to happen on these bases. So there's kind of two factors that equation sets up, right? One is how strong is the interest in discriminating in these cases, and then two is how much discrimination is there. So I'll take those in turn, right? How much interest is there in achieving diversity? And I would say quite a bit. Diversity, we know, and this is from our quantitative research, makes our institutions fairer, because when you have more diverse staff, more diverse faculty, more diverse personnel, it leads to narrower achievement gaps. It leads to policies that are applied more equally. So there's a strong institutional element. There's also an intellectual element that you benefit from getting to know people who are different from you. Diversity is a good thing. Diversity incorporates a lot of things. Affirmative action, as it has been construed, incorporates only and singularly race. And there's other elements of different backgrounds that you would benefit from, right? Somebody who grew up in a very rural area is going to be underrepresented in elite institutions or in elite professions. Women are going to be less represented. Trans people are going to be less represented. People from working class backgrounds are going to be more represented. So there's a lot that goes into diversity and fostering a diverse community. And affirmative action has been singularly focused on race as the only form of diversity that gets to count and gets to justify the discrimination that we've seen in elite university admissions. Why is that? Well, speaking as political scientists, we can say that it's a path dependency. And a path dependency essentially means it is a fact. It is a result. It is a downstream result of what the thinking was when these policies were installed. These were, like Dr. Frieder said, the result of the civil rights era. The focus was at that point singularly on race. We know a lot more about diversity now, and a lot more, and there's been a lot of movement over the last 50 years. Most Black and most Hispanic students do have poorer access to schooling than most white students. But I say most because it's not all. It's a complex thing. And in fact, if we're focused primarily on the quality of schooling that people have had, we would focus more so on class and we would focus on race. I'm not saying that race doesn't have a role in it. It is harder to be a minority in the United States. It's harder to be Black. It's harder to be Hispanic than it is to be white. But that's not to say that everybody is exactly the same. So there is an interest in having diversity. There is an interest in having racial diversity. Does that interest overwhelm the harm that is done by discrimination? And I would say there it depends on how much discrimination is happening. If there's a little bit of discrimination, I don't know. We can kind of sit with that. It's uncomfortable. Maybe it happens, right? That's a debate to have. If it's an overwhelming amount of discrimination, that to me would be in violation of the core principles that we have in a liberal society. And at these elite institutions, I would say that it is an overwhelming amount of discrimination that was happening in their admissions processes. If you look at the briefs that were proposed, that were brought in the most recent Supreme Court case, and you look specifically at the one decile, so decile is every group of 10%, the decile below average. So this is the first set of students who are below average in terms of their academic achievement, the 40th to 50th percentile. Now, a place like Harvard, the admission rate is about 4%. You wouldn't expect any applicant who is below their average qualification to get in at all. You wouldn't expect most candidates who are above their average candidate to get in. you would really only expect it to be the top few. And for white and Asian students, that was the case. The admit rate was 2% or below. And in fact, the racial group that performed worst in this decile below average was Asian students. Asian Americans face discrimination as well, as we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic especially. Among Hispanic applicants, it was up to 11%. Among Black applicants, it was up to 22%. So between the lowest to the highest group in this, the comparable group of academic achievement, there was an 11 times swing. The odds multiplier was 11. We can say that if there's a factor that multiplies your odds by 11 times, that's probably a major factor. It's not a minor factor at that point. And from there, again, we said, a little discrimination, a lot of discrimination, a little maybe we can sit with and have a debate about. What does the American public say about something like that? Well, the Pew Research Center conducted a poll of the American public, and they asked, how much of a factor should race be in university admissions? Should it be a major factor? Should it be a minor factor? Or should it be no factor at all? And I'm focused specifically here on Black and Hispanic respondents to the survey. Where was I? 11% of Hispanic respondents said that it should be a major factor. 18% of Black Americans said that it should be a major factor, which is to say exceptionally few. Some more said that it should be a minor factor, but for both groups, big majorities, over 60% in both cases, said that race shouldn't play a factor at all. So what I'm arguing here, and there is kind of some overlap between our positions, is not that diversity is not important. It is vitally important. It's not that it's not that procedures or processes that give an extra point to somebody who's from a divergent background, whether that's in terms of race, whether that's in terms of class, in terms of disability status, are bad. In fact, it seems like that could be a way to create these more diverse communities. And I think if that's where we had been, this would not be objectionable at all. And when I think back to my experience as an admissions officer, again, I wasn't at Harvard, but I was at a place where we did take a close look at every applicant to kind of make sure that admitting them would be to the benefit of our institution. Did we have affirmative action? It was never expressed to me that way. What I described, what I remember, we did care about diversity, and if it seemed like somebody would add diversity, that was attractive to us. And I think if that's where it was, and in most cases that's where it is, it's not something that we have big debates about. It's it's really something that elite institutions have kind of gotten ahead of themselves, right? Elite institutions have these status contests where they find different statuses, whether it's average test scores. And in this case, it's the percentage of students who come from historically underrepresented backgrounds, where they compare against each other and they get into an arms race. And that's led them to go way overboard. It's led it to become a bigger political issue than it had to be. And I think it's ultimately to the detriment of all of the public schools, all of the police departments, who are doing it in this very minor way so that they can get better outcomes for their citizens. And now they face the wrath of public opinion because of what Harvard was doing, trying to look better than Yale.
I'll just jump in really quickly in terms of we do very much have some overlap in our positions there. I absolutely agree with Professor Warner's characterization of the elite program's way of doing affirmative action is egregious. Absolutely.
Okay, all right. I think those were fairly comprehensive answers. So I'm going to, in the interest of time and making sure that we get the opportunity to hear from the audience as well, I'm just going to ask a basic question and ask you both to limit yourself to a very short response here, which is that we've made the point here, basically, that discrimination on the account of race is not constitutional according to our interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And the background is sort of that we also know that there are all of these forms of kind of structural discrimination that result in these racial inequalities that aren't necessarily covered by the Constitution, right? There's no way to legislate the legality of all of the different benefits that I accrue from being a white, wealthy male or whatever identities I might hold or not hold. So the question is, in the absence of an ability to kind of like massively solve structural discrimination, should we engage in affirmative action, or is the principle of discrimination so important that we can't do so even though we know it is in response to structural discrimination? So how do you sort of balance those things out? And either one of you can take it.
So in terms of thinking of affirmative action, is that discrimination or not? I'm going to dodge your question twice, and then I'm going to actually answer it. The first answer I'm going to give is a legal one, which is I'll go back to the Fisher v. Texas case in 2016, where the court did find a compelling interest by the state in trying to reach outcomes of diversity as an actual college outcome. So legally, I think that my argument still stands with that. I would say legally it's not discrimination. If we do like a poor student assignment, Merriam-Webster dictionary defines discrimination as the terms like hateful or unjust are thrown in there. So no, I don't think that that would be hateful or unjust. But is it discrimination in the sense that we are making a decision on the basis of at least some non-race neutral outcome? And I would say, yeah. And again, even sitting here saying this, like, does it make me a little bit uncomfortable to say something like, maybe there is some value in having non-race neutral outcomes or non-race neutral practices to undo some of the damage that we've done in the past? Yeah, that's uncomfortable. And I think that we should kind of sit with the discomfort. You know, I'm not upset with like any students here that like might be experiencing guilt for the past. You shouldn't. That's an unproductive emotion to experience about this. I'm, I guess, upset with like many generations past of my ancestors creating this mess that we all have to kind of solve now. So I do think that it is worth trying to correct it that way. And this is a metaphor I've used if you've been in my class before. It is just, if we're talking not income, but wealth especially, 300 years for people to collect wealth versus not collect any wealth whatsoever. If anyone's played the game of Monopoly, you know you cannot expect someone to start the game on turn 50 and have any chance of competing with the other players. It's just not doable. So if we're going to have to discriminate a little bit, I don't know. I would say maybe we could discriminate at the level, not at the college admissions if that makes us uncomfortable. We could, I don't know, make sure K through 12 funding of schools was even across districts. So if we want to do that instead, I'd be all for it.
To defer. All right. With the final word has been said on the subject.
Sure.
You lost your discretion.
That's okay.
I think we're looking for yes. Okay. All right.
Hey.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much. In many ways, it seems like we're just getting started and it's already been an hour. We do want to make sure that we give an opportunity for you, the audience, to ask the panelists questions. And I'll ask that you make your way, if you have questions, to make your way to either microphone on the side over here by the UNF banner, and here you see the microphone next to the wall. I'd ask that you don't handle the microphone too much because they are set perfectly for the recording of this program. So who has questions? And make your way, please, to the microphone, and would love to hear your questions. And we will start to my right. Yes?
I think it's also worth considering, but what about the concept of legacy admissions? You know, basically, if you're a descendant of an alumni or a donor, I should know because, as crazy as it sounds, my mother actually went to UNF, and if I recall correctly, I literally got accepted within a week. So with personal experience on that one, I could kind of understand that. I got it worth putting out there.
Okay.
Oh, I don't know.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And who would like to address the question of legacy admissions?
Sure, yeah. So legacy admissions is, as Luke was saying, legacy admissions is the practice of giving an edge up to students whose parents attended an institution. And the way it's worked in elite universities, right, is applicants to an elite university where admission rates might be 5% or 10% or 20%, have historically been put into 4 bins, right? The first bin is athletes who are there to, improve the quality of the athletic program. The second bin is for underrepresented minorities. The third bin is for legacy students. And then the fourth bin is for everybody else. And the admission rate in the fourth bin is usually somewhere around 1 or 2%. There's not a whole lot of room left after the first three concerns have been taken care of. The justification for it is that one way that Harvard competes with Yale is on the basis of what's called its yield rate. So what percentage of students who are admitted actually attend? If you have a higher yield rate, it's seen that you're more desirable than another school. And so legacy admissions is a way to pad that. Also, legacies tend to be more wealthy, so they tend to need less financial aid. So you get more tuition money by admitting and enrolling legacy students on average. Is any of this satisfactory? No. Given the public, given the public function that these elite institutions serve, yeah, that doesn't seem. It is a form of discrimination. It has far less of a rationale than does affirmative action because it's not leading toward diversity. It's solely an institutional concern. They both kind of go hand in hand because they're both parts of university enrollment. But yeah, legacy admissions is a bit of a bogeyman. And nobody, even a few of these elite institutions are trying to claim the status of being first mover. Amherst College in Massachusetts is a very fancy liberal arts college. And they were the first mover to say, we're not going to do that anymore. And there are a few others that have followed trying to get the status of saying no first. But it is still a reality.
Thank you, Dr. Warner. We'll come to this side and we'll come back to you. Yes.
So I had two questions, but I'll go with the shorter one for sake of time.
Thank you.
Okay. So why are we discriminating based on race as far as your objections to the wealth accumulation goes? Wouldn't it be more direct to discriminate based on wealth accumulation and assign those preferences for the students that need them regardless of their race?
So it's a good question. I'm glad you brought it up. Could we do, instead of doing race-specific affirmative action, could we do affirmative action based on class, wealth instead? I like that. I think we should. And to go off of what Professor Warner was just saying, legacy admissions, I also think that's a problem for precisely the reason that you bring up. We have an issue where people with less incomes are able to get there. So why use race as a proxy instead of using class? I think we can get most of what we want by using class. That said, I would still say there is an additional component. Class is going to be very correlated in a lot of ways with race, but at the same time, there is an extra diversity component that we would want to bring in that's just race. So even if you could imagine that we didn't have any class-based differences on race, you could still imagine there's still that argument about the value of having a diverse student body. And the interactions those people are going to have that you wouldn't necessarily get with class. So I don't disagree at all with your point. I think that class-based affirmative action would be very desirable. I think other ways to try and focus on those class differences at earlier stages, as I mentioned, making things more equal across districts before you get to college is actually a preferable solution to me compared to affirmative action. Any system that considers money, I would be very much in favor of that as well.
Thank you.
If I may, I'll add a little. There are two quotations that stood out to me from politicians over the last 50 years, and they kind of point in opposite directions, right? One was from John Lewis, who is the Atlanta area congressman. He was chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, and he said that even despite the levels that he had reached, in his life and in his career. Folks who didn't know his face, who didn't know who he was, would still treat him like a schmuck sometimes, right? You get treated like a schmuck by a security guard, or, what are you doing here? Because he was a black man, right? So I think there is an independent effect, even if we count for class, of it being hard to be a minority, of it being hard to be black in America. The other quotation that I'm reminded of is Barack Obama. And Barack Obama, of course, is a Democrat, and he's a proponent of affirmative action. At the same time, he said, given all the privilege that they've had in their lives, it would not be fair for his children, Sasha and Malia, to get an edge up based on the color of their skin. So I think, class probably does do most of it, but there is an independent effect of race as well. And how that's operationalized, that's a question for debate.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sorry.
Thank you.
I promise to be incredibly pithy with this, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that a lot of this misses maybe the main point, which is what is college for? Is college a reward for doing a really good job in your first 18 years, or a college is supposed to be engines of social change? And if you have different views of what universities are actually for, you will find that these debates are so far removed for what college is for like the average person, right? These colleges are determining on these very infinitesimal levels of like who's the best, smartest, good boy or young lady or any non-binary gender identity that deserves to go to Harvard. No one really deserves to go to Harvard. They're profoundly unequal, overly wealthy institutions. And at most places, what colleges are interested in doing is providing students with skills that they can use to advance and move forward. And in that case, I think colleges should be empowered to pick those students who they think will benefit the most from that. And our country has generally discriminated against very specific identities that I think it's perfectly fine to pick on that basis. So that's a much stronger, like more direct defense of it that I think maybe needs to be articulated.
And thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Yes.
Hello, I really enjoyed the debate. I wanted to start off by saying that, and I have a question, but it also kind of relates to something that I'm reading right now. It's called Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond. And I kind of want to reiterate something that Professor Frieder said, which is that the wealth gap between Black and white families, like this book kind of discusses that. So I could kind of read a quick excerpt. Today, the wealth gap between Black and white families is as large as it was in the 1960s. Our legacy of systemically denying Black people to the nation's land and riches has been passed down from generation to generation. Most first-time homebuyers get down payment help from their parents. Many of those parents pitch in by refinancing their own homes, as their parents did for them after the government subsidized home ownership in white communities in the wake of World War II. So in 2019, the median white household had a net worth of $188,000. In comparison, the median Black household has $24,000 like overall net worth. So that includes like, property value, like Frieder was saying, and also just like different things, generations of money being passed down. So I guess my question is, how do we basically deal with the issue of like educational inequality? Because we know that that could be tied to like people's finances and like people who have historically been privileged in that manner. So that's my question.
Yeah, I'll try and keep my remarks really brief here, just because I can see we've got a few more questions to get to. But one, thank you for the empirical assist. It's good to hear the stats. There it is. There's the book right there. Two, I'll just give like a quick story just from my own life. And it's not much of a story, it's just a statement. I don't have, through my own family, a ton of generational wealth built up, but I have some. And grad school is difficult. It takes a while. You have to take out loans. And I can say very confidently, I would not be speaking in front of this audience right now if I didn't have some of that generational wealth, at least a little bit, to fall back on. So I think that, that just reinforces the basic point that one of the ways, it takes a lot more than this probably, but one of the ways that we can try and reduce that gap is through educational attainment.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes.
All right, so I have two questions. The first is that a lot of these elite institutions that we're looking at, that we're saying are using affirmative action too heavily, have been facing a lot of criticism for not expanding. They're making a lot more money than other institutions. Is it possible that we could, remedy the difference created by affirmative action by simply having these elite institutions start a campus at the nearest place they can find a plot of land and then raise the amount of, say, white and Asian students that they're able to take through just having a higher capacity for students. And then the other question is, that the Students for Fair Admissions have actually started to bring another case, this time trying to get rid of affirmative action at the United States Service Academies. So, do you think this is going to make the academies worse off, better off? Are they going to be more liberal or conservative as a result? So I think there's a vested interest for basically everyone sitting in this room to know what is the future of our nation's military going to look like. Thank you.
You.
So yeah, I mean, I'll take the overview. The service academies were exempted from the most recent court decision in the Harvard and the North Carolina cases. That is something that could come up later, and they were exempted with a very short, like, hey, we think the military should get to decide, right, in interest of military readiness if diversity is a compelling interest for them, right? So it was an explicit carve out to be determined in the future, but yet you bring up something very interesting, that it was, the Supreme Court spent a lot of time in the opinion talking about, you know, how diversity for diversity's sake wasn't that persuasive of an argument to them, and then specifically said, okay, but in this, you know, one instance, we'll let the military make this determination. To your first point, we can't compel private, you know, institutions like Harvard to go have another campus and to spend their money in certain ways and to expand their classes. That's just, you know, not something we can really compel or control.
But yeah, so the answer to that, which is like the radical answer, but the true answer in my opinion, we're sharing personal anecdotes. I happened to go to a very fancy schmancy prep school for high school. And then after that, I was only educated at public institutions. I went to a public institution for my undergrad that had 27,000 students. My high school had 980 students. My high school's endowment was $1.5 billion. My college's endowment as the flagship state school of Massachusetts was $300 million. That's just not acceptable. And that's why we should ban private education, abolish all of them, and take all of their wealth and reinvest it in public education. Because frankly, if they're going to behave this way, they cannot be trusted with that money. So I would like to compel them. And I think this is a serious reason why private education is in many ways not an engine of social change. It doesn't do what we think universities should do. It just reinforces them. They're profoundly economically conservative places.
Despite all that private education, you tied your tie, like, retied your tie like 10 times.
Yeah, I like still don't really know how to do this, so it didn't teach me anything.
Thank you. Yes.
All right. I'm a little loud, so I'm not going to use the microphone.
Well, I wish you would get closer to the mic because we are recording this.
Okay. So, first of all, can we give them a round of applause for being here tonight?
Oh, wow. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you guys for being here. You guys touched on it a little bit, but when you were covering all the different forms of discrimination, there was something that you guys talked about with SAT and ACT scores, and it was that it's kind of inherently biased and discriminatory towards people of poorer households. So how do you guys think that we should go about that? And even like with other metrics besides that score, it's still extremely difficult to get a good understanding of people, even based off of like just like a background check, even, which is what every company relies on to check to see how good the character is. So what would you guys, if you could, because this is definitely like a harder question, I guess, what would you guys recommend we as the next generation would do to try to fight that?
Thank you.
I think it's an excellent question, and I think it's one that I almost have to say there's a lot of things we could do that I think are going to be very difficult to do. I think what I can say with confidence is that the way we've tried to resolve that in the past doesn't really work. So in my experience as an SAT, ACT tutor, I did take on some students that come from lower class backgrounds, and I took on more than really I probably even should at the time, given I was a starving student at the time as well. But I took these on because I felt guilty, basically, about mostly getting my money in prepping the other students. So the way that they got around that was that they would offer basically grants to families to try and even that out, which I think a lot of the time that's what we try and do. It's a little bit to James's point here, but it's what we do to try and even things out is maybe, okay, we have this enormous amount of private wealth that are changing things. Let's maybe use a little bit of private wealth to try and even the playing field. And we just can't use a little bit of wealth to even the playing field of a lot of wealth. So at the very least, I can say I know it doesn't work. I do think it's probably a good idea that we're moving away from the SAT and ACT at a lot of places. That means we're, in terms of objective measures, kind of left with the GPA system at high schools. And that makes me deeply uncomfortable as well, because I think that varies tremendously across schools. So I think it maybe means, unfortunately, unfortunately, we might have to lean more on some of the holistic aspects. But now AI, which to prep our second debates that's coming up later this semester, AI is going to make it hard to do holistic judgments, because now the essays you write, I don't know, are the essays you write. I don't know if you have anything. You did the actual admissions, so maybe you have an idea of a way to get us out of this.
Go ahead, Seth.
I do a little bit. So historically, basically we've seen two approaches to college admission. First is the raw qualifications, right? They would look at your test score and they'd look at your GPA. And then they'd also look at the quality of school that you went to. So weight your GPA with the quality of school, and that usually had the effect of helping very wealthy people get into elite institutions. From there, what they went to is what's called holistic admissions, which is we want to get a sense of what kind of person you are. We want to see what extracurriculars you do. We want to read your college essay and to see if you can express yourself in pithy ways, and we'll add to our community. And this is what I derisively call the beauty pageant approach to admissions. And the beauty pageant approach to admissions also benefits the very wealthy, because they know how, if nothing else, how to put on a good presentation. I think what I would say is probably the way forward is really to pare it down to things that are as objective as possible. I think grades are one. I don't have quite as negative a view of test scores. I think a lot of the studies there have faced selection bias, and I can talk more about that, but I won't right now. But beyond that, looking, at extracurriculars, really just weighing everything the same, right? You were president of your debate club. Good for you, right? You lettered in a sport. That's great. You took care of your grandma because, she's old and sick. That should count just as much. So basically really paring it down so that, you're kind of, from an admission standpoint, you're not so much trying to find the best one, but you're separating students into tranches. And that's what I remember from reading, hundreds and hundreds of files, is that, that there was the middle, there was the bottom, and there was the top, and it wasn't very easy really to distinguish within those groups. And if it's a selective institution, if they're only looking at the top, they should be bigger. They should bring in more of them. At an extreme, they should have a lottery, because I don't see it getting much fairer if we're looking at what, very educated, relatively wealthy admissions officers resonates with them. I think that's an area where bias is going to come in. So, that's my thought.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lerner. You wanted to weigh in before we move on?
No, I think Dr. Warner covered it. I mean, I am a Pell Grant recipient from Title I high school student, and holistic admissions, as I said before, and test merit-based admissions both have problems, and they both can lead. A holistic admissions too can lead to the kind of arms race where you're trying to get into as many extracurriculars as possible, and that too is often based on wealth and time. So Dr. Warner had the very excellent that holistic admission should be considering more than it is now. Maybe your family circumstances, of your care obligations, or if you are a parent as a student. If you are a working student, right? This is something that I think that elite institutions really, really miss students who are kind of working their way through school and are responsible for their own tuition.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll do a quick time check. We're a little bit over time. We will entertain our final 4 questions and encourage our panelists to be pithy, as you have referenced in the past. So let's hear our final 4 questions.
First of all, I would like to give a shout out to my professor Sean Feeder for inspiring me to go to this debate. Yeah, round of applause for him. Yeah, but I want to ask what's your name again?
Warner.
Dr.
Oh yeah, Dr. Warner. Yeah, I want to ask you a question going back to the pro-free speech, because we talked about the public universities stance on freedom of speech, but what about private companies like social media? Because I've heard situations about them moving people because of what they say, and some have argued well, they're private, so they could do, if they want to do that, they can. But where do you stand on that? Do you think they should do that or no?
Yeah. I mean, I don't have a fully developed opinion. One of my colleagues, Kevin Munger, he's a professor at Penn State University, wrote an excellent piece called Private Governments, and it talks about how really a lot of what we say in our lives, the range of expressions we have, are governed by these institutions that aren't necessarily accountable to an elected, to the body politic, right? But yeah, there is a very strong public-private divide. And yeah, you know, like if you say something that makes your company look bad, your company can fire you. That they're not subject to the same First Amendment restrictions as public institutions are.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Hello. My question it's for all of you guys or whoever chooses to answer it. Do groups of people that experienced injustice in the past, do you think they're more deserving in college than those who didn't? And if you do, why, and why do those things matter in this time and age?
I mean, I can try this. I mean, I think I'm gonna dodge it a little bit, but I promise it's in the spirit of it. I think that this question of deserving and deservingness is part of what makes college admissions feel so emotionally charged in a way that maybe they ought not to be. I remember being rejected from almost every elite institution and turning over in my head, like, why do other people get this? I deserve this. And the fact is just true that there aren't enough spots in elite universities for the students who are qualified to go there. Harvard could fill itself up 45 times, more than that, arguably, right? All of these places could. And so there's this artificial scarcity that causes us to pit one another against each other on the basis of, well, that person only got in because they're black, or that person only got in because they have this thing that's going for them. And the real solution would be, of course, for universities to not be picking and deciding which groups that have been discriminated against belong more than others. It's that everyone should have the right to a high quality education. And so in the absence of that, we get these really like strange, upsetting policies where we weigh someone's race as a quality of their deservingness to get an education. And in its best form, it's the university is saying we would like to be people who help bring people out of poverty or address some of these injustices. And in that case, I suppose it's all right. But I think that you've pointed to this thing that makes us pretty uncomfortable, which is that where we ascribe some value to belonging to a group that's been discriminated against, instead of saying this group has been discriminated against, and thus we need to do something to address that previous wrong.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, your question?
Yes. So like one of my questions is concerning like admissions, obviously, because that's like a hot topic right now. And it's the fact that like race, and in my opinion, I don't think race shouldn't really, should not even be considered a factor at all. Because like, it's, you know, because even if you, what you call do or do not, you're still like inherently discriminating based upon that policy. And I think that economic policy as well is also a form of discrimination. And that's actually primarily based on federal financial aid, because it essentially is discriminating the middle class because it's providing money to the lower class, but then the wealthy class already has enough money, and yet no money is pooled into the middle class. So like if you have like select individuals that the what you call the federal government says, oh, your federal financial contribution is $26,000. That's a lot of money. I'm like, do you think a middle class individual or like a student can afford $26,000 per year or $13,000 per semester? No. But yet, for, say low class individuals, they say that they can afford $8,000, but then they get all these scholarships and they're able to pay it off free. And yet wealthy people can also pay it off because of all the, what you call merit-based scholarships and, what you call money given from their family, from general wealth. But like middle-class individuals like me, you're not really going to get a lot of scholarships because you're not poor. And, you're not going to get, a lot of scholarships because you can't attend SATs because you're still, relatively poor. and then you're not even given federal financial aid because, you're in the middle of the pack. Why pursue the middle of the pack when you can pursue the bottom of the trench, whereas the middle people are trudging in mud here.
Okay.
And they're still suffering while the people that are lower class are sinking and then being pulled out, whereas the middle class is still trudging in mud.
Look,
I
see me afterwards because I have a spot for you on the next debate.
So
thank you.
I know we're trying to get out of here, so I'll just address, there's various things we could address there, but I think you have correctly identified that there is something of a donut hole, as we sometimes refer to this, where maybe there are gaps that are actually not being solved, and I think that the middle class is absolutely being squeezed in these kinds of situations. So I think that we really should look at what's happening to the middle class, not just people that are on the lowest end of struggling, and address that donut hole. I think this also touches on sort of what Professor Fahey had talked about, which is that maybe we're approaching this in a way that's not the quite right way to do it. We should flood the system with these kinds of benefits and opportunities rather than worry about who's going to have access to what are these scarce resources that don't necessarily have to be scarce. So I appreciate the point.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And our final question for tonight. Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
I want to say I appreciate the event. I've never seen a debate like this, but I just had a question because as someone who's coming from, I guess you'd say like an urban area, and my mother had to hardship for me to go to an A+ school because the school in my area was a C+ school, and my mother always wanted me to go to college. I wanted to see, after it being like around half a century since Brown versus the Board of Education, I haven't seen any difference in the school system, period, especially for Black and Latinx people in America. So I want to see if you want to take away the race, I guess, the race category and admissions, which I did not know that was a category. I don't want to just be at UNF because I am Black, but I want to know if that's not a category, what is a good, I guess, alternative, because I don't see any other alternative. Yeah.
I think that touches on something that you both have addressed in terms of socioeconomic status. That you want to add more to those comments?
I don't know. I speak to it a bit in the next section so I'll defer my comments till then.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And anyone else want to chime in? I know we're going to do a quick
I'll
round.
just say that affirmative action was developed as a blunt instrument, right, to try to remedy at the college admissions level inequities in K-12 funding and education. It may or may not have been the right instrument. The hard work would have been to fix K-12 schools, and that is work that there hasn't been a lot of political appetite for.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for your question. We have one final round, and we are right at 2 minutes.
So we're going to make this ultra quick. We wanted to sort of do a palate cleanser to close things out. An assignment that I've been giving to many of the people that are still in this room with us is what constitutional amendment would you make and why? And so we thought it might be fun to just do now a very quick roundtable on this. So I don't know where we want to start here. You want to go down? You want to start here? Oh, okay. You got it.
Which is interesting because in the tradition of political science, Professor Lerner did you always pick last in these things. So I'm going to say that I got last choice in my amendment, but I am passionate about it. So I want to put the right to privacy as a constitutional amendment. And I want to go beyond bodily autonomy for abortion or birth control or any of that, but that would also cover things like your health decisions, be that your vaccination status, your electronic privacy, expanding maybe privacy rights that we also find in the third, fourth, and fifth amendments as well. So constitutional right to privacy is mine.
Thank you.
All right, I'll go really briefly. It seems a little bit quaint compared to these very intense, important day-to-day issues, but I would get rid of equal representation by state in the Senate, and because I think that is just fundamentally anti-democratic. You know, the lowest 25 population states have 50 senators between them, and they have less of a population than California. That's just kind of outrageous. And I would also get rid of the Electoral College. We're the only industrialized democracy that mediates between what you want and who the president is. And I think that those would have some downstream effects, but I'm pro-democracy and anti-free speech, apparently. And so that's why I will articulate that.
Thank you, Dr. Frieder.
I'm going to be harmed the most by the speed round here because mine's the most complicated, so I'm going to look like a crazy person as I explain this. But a lot of my students for the constitutional amendment chose something like a maximum age for serving in Congress. If you think that that's spicy, hold my beer. Here we go. My amendment, 2 parts. The first part, the sweet part. If you are an older individual in the United States, you have worked your entire life, you should not worry about retirement, you should not want for anything, you should have guaranteed in the Constitution Social Security and Medicare. Here's the sour spot: stop impacting society. I think there should be a maximum voting age of 70. Let's say we can play with the age, but 70 I'm good. Is it because of cognitive decline? No. Is it because of intelligence? No. Is it because of their opinions? No. It's because it's not a good dynamic for us to maybe be 50 or 60 before we come of dominant political age. And we're trying to solve problems 20 years out. So I'm saying voluntarily, when I hit 70, take away my rights.
Thank you. Dr. Warner.
Yeah, so in our discussion of affirmative action, we talked about universities and their role in rectifying inequalities in American society. And I think ultimately it's too much of a burden to place on universities when universities come 18 years into your lives. So speaking to the last question a little bit, my constitutional amendment is a constitutional right to an education. San Antonio versus Rodriguez is a famous Supreme Court case that says students don't necessarily have the right to equally funded education, and I believe that they do have that right. School funding in the United States is based off of local property taxes, and that means the people who live in well-to-do areas get a better elementary and secondary education than people who grew up in poor areas. And I think that's a violation of our American core cultural value of equal opportunities. So my constitutional amendment would be to install a new civil right and incorporate it into the Constitution to an equal and a fair education.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Please continue to give a round of applause to our fabulous panelists. Professor Adrienne Lerner, Dr. James Fahey, Dr. Sean Frieder, and Dr. Seth Warner, all from the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. We thank you. We appreciate you. I'd like to, as you are leaving, I'd like to remind you, and thank you for coming to the first event for the UNF Office of Public Policy Events. The next event will be on artificial intelligence, friend or foe. You'll see advertisement about it coming soon. I know we focused a lot on affirmative action, but to reflect back on the free expression, please go to the unf.edu website, and there is a free expression website, free expression on campus website that was developed last year to address these very same topics. Go there and learn more about free expression, First Amendment, and counter programming, etc. Thank you all for being here. I really, really appreciate you, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Good night.